Hi everyone, welcome to the self-knowledge lectures. Today we are going to be studying the lecture number 23 of phase a very important lecture in which we are going to be talking about fanaticism and Mythomania, right? And why are we going to talk about this? Because these two defects are serious obstacles that can completely block any real progress on the inner or spiritual path. And actually, in earlier times, this was the very first topic to anyone aspiring to awaken their consciousness because one of the first challenges that we face and the strongest challenges that we face on this path towards self knowledge is self deception. That is why this lecture is so important. And the goal of this lecture is to help us recognize these defects, but within ourselves, right? Both fanaticism and mythomania. We need to learn how to observe how they show up in our own psyche, right? Because it is very easy to notice these defects in other people, but the real challenge is to detect them within ourselves, often hidden in very subtle ways, right? And most importantly, we need to understand the consequences of falling into self-deception because of these two psychological defects. So let's begin by explaining what is fanaticism. What exactly is fanaticism? As you can see here, is like blindness, right? Because a fanatic is someone who shows like excessive zeal or passion for something he believes in. And this defect can express itself in anything we strongly believe in, anything we feel like the urge to defend with intensity and even with aggression or violence sometimes, right? Uh, because the fanatic like clings to their belief with that rigid attachment, right? They don't want anyone to question their beliefs, to touch it, right? And when someone like challenges that belief or offers a different perspective, right? What the fanatic does, the fanatic in us reacts with anger, with rage, and sometimes even with violence. Fanaticism makes us feel that what we believe is superior to what others believe. And that simply by believing in that, we are already safe or we are superior or more special than others, right? And that is one of the traps of fanaticism because it convinces us that just because we believe in something, we are already safe, right? And fanaticism isn't limited to religion. We can become fanatics about many things: sport teams, celebrities, right? Political figures, ideas, movements, bands, musical genders, and so on, right? But perhaps the most dangerous form of fanaticism is religious fanaticism, because in that case, people feel that the very salvation of their soul is on the line, right? And this fear often overrides reason and leads to blind, aggressive defense of that belief or that religious ideology, even without reflection, right? Because fanaticism blinds us to the truth that our beliefs are often nothing more than social conditioning, right? Ideas that we never truly have verified for ourselves, but that we have simply absorbed from our environment, from our culture, right? From our parents. In fact, if we had been born somewhere else in the world, right, with another family, we will likely hold very different beliefs, but we will be defending them just as fiercely as we are defending the ones that we have now. So those are things like to reflect on, because if we don't reflect on those things, fanaticism will become in us like a kind of mental illness, because that is what it is. The fanatic feels chosen, right, or favored by God. merely because they believe in something. And in extreme cases, as you know, they might even lose their moral compass, beating or abandoning even their own children for not following the family's belief, attacking others over any sort of fanaticism point, like attacking others over political or sport related views, or even killing in the name of God, right? And why does this happen? Because the psychological defect of fanaticism like clouds our ability to distinguish between belief from reality. It like clouds our rationality. It gives raised to blind faith, right? A kind of belief that discourages inquiry. Blind faith is often fueled by fear, right? Fear of punishment, fear of hell, and so on, right? And many times this blind faith is intentionally encouraged by those who tell you, don't question, just believe. And well, it's important to understand that fanaticism exists on both sides. Not only religious or spiritual fanaticism, but also atheist, because a religious fanatic might blindly accept ideas about divinity without ever verifying them, right? But just the same, an atheist might cling tightly to materialistic views, refusing to explore or to even consider the possibility of higher realities or spiritual experiences, without ever try to even verify the reality. Both are actually trapped in rigid beliefs in without direct knowledge, and that is fanaticism. So in us, how can we discover the fanatic within ourselves? Well, we can start by noticing how we react when someone disagrees with those things that we believe, especially when someone challenges a belief or prefers that we like hold dear. How we react, there is the fanatic in us. Do we feel defensive? Do we feel irritated or even furious? Well, there is the fanatic. We can also observe that part of us that is content with just believing, that never seeks real personal experience or the direct verification of those that we are defending, right, as a truth. And we can also observe that part of us that believes that salvation comes simply from that belief comes only from belonging to somewhere, that our salvation will come from belonging to a religion or by believing in a specific God. There we find the fanatic. Yeah, actually, real salvation, true inner transformation comes from consciousness, from a conscious work on ourselves. It comes from knowing, from directly experience deeply, and from awakening our full consciousness. Okay, and what happens that once we receive this very knowledge that we are receiving in these lectures, once we understand what needs to be done to awaken our consciousness, we receive the three factors for consciousness revolution. We already have the tools to work on ourselves. Actually, two paths open before us. One is the path of the believer that will take us to, even with this knowledge, with this objective knowledge, to develop the fanatic self. To right. And the other one is the path of the practitioner, or the practical path. And as soon as we begin to resonate with this teaching, our inner fanatic will try to push us towards the path of the believer. Or unfortunately, that is the path that most people take, right? And what is the path of the believer? Well, the believer is the one who thinks that simply with knowing is enough. And from the very moment of receiving a certain knowledge, he begins to act as if they were already saint, right? As if they are holy. That is what we do when we start resonating with some spiritual path or when receiving this knowledge, the fanatic doesn't really work on themselves, but they are already, I mean, the psychological defects of fanaticism in us, they are already trying to find in ourselves how we are already good, how we are already conscious, how we are already superior, how we don't have psychological defects. Instead of working on ourselves to really self-observe, to discover the defect, to discover our weak points, to try to find where are those things that we need to work on to really change, right? The believer wants other to see them as someone who's changing, right? They want to feel aligned with the belief they now profess. And so they begin to repress their psychological defects, especially when they are in public, or when they are around people they are not close to, right? They present themselves as kind, patient, even holy people. But when they are alone, or when they are with the people they trust, like close family or friends, they reveal their true state, right? The defects they never really worked on come to the surface because they were only being suppressed, not transformed, right? And a particular trait of this believer mindset is that it's highly intellectual. This person loves to absorb knowledge, but only on a intellectual level, right? They are always looking for more videos, more text, more books, more theories. They want to feel informed about spirituality, about consciousness, but they don't like to practice. They'll watch videos about it. They will read about these things, but they won't actually do the practices. And this is a very common mistake in these teachings, right? Believing that just because we are learning new concepts, our consciousness is awakening. But that is completely false, right? Awakening doesn't come at all through intellectual knowledge alone. It comes through walking the other path, the path of the practitioner. That is the one that will take us to real experience, because the practical person doesn't just believe everything they hear. Instead, they focus on practicing in order to verify what they have learned. They make an effort to apply the tools they're being given with patience, with discipline, until they begin to see real results. So, through the wisdom that comes from their own experiences, from their own inner work, then the practical person becomes truly independent. They no longer need to rely on the opinions or the belief of others, because their understandings are coming from direct personal experience, right? And this kind of knowledge is real because it has been tested. It has been confirmed through practice. It is not borrowed. It is lived, right? And that's why the practitioner or the practical person is the only one who actually begins to advance on the inner path, because real progress only comes from the work we do consciously and consistently, right? Through the daily efforts that we do to apply the three factors for the revolution of consciousness, and through the practices that we learn to verify these things, because it is the practical person who walks the path of transformation, because without psychological death, there can be no liberation of consciousness. So if we are not practicing consistently the psychological death, self-observing, judging ourselves, asking our Divine Mother for the elimination of our psychological defects, how can we come to awaken our consciousness if consciousness is there, trapped within all our psychological defects? But the defect of fanaticism tends us to believe that we don't have psychological defects, that we are like godlike humans, that don't have any psychological defects. That is not true. We must work on ourselves to discover those defects, to understand them, right? Through self-observation, through judging ourselves, and from their elimination is from where consciousness will arise. And without the liberation of our consciousness, we cannot recover the wisdom that is trapped within all those defects. If we don't practice this spiritual birth, the suprasexual practice, we are not going to develop the existential bodies of the being, and without them we won't be able to access all the sorts of wisdom that there is across all the dimensions of nature. And if we don't sacrifice ourselves for humanity, we won't develop real love, right? And our inner progress will be totally blocked. And ultimately, if we don't practice, we won't be able to verify anything for ourselves. And the practical one understands all this and begins to apply the teachings, showing through their own life the results of their inner work. And this deeply irritates the fanatic people who, driven by laziness and envy, still hopes to achieve self-realization without doing the work. So we can also discover details of fanaticism in ourselves when we see others advancing spiritually, doing things, and we feel annoyed by their advancements, right? And it's important that we analyze some of the details of the fanatic defect so that we can begin to discover them within ourselves through self-observation. Because only by recognizing these details and eliminating these defects from our psychology can we move forward in our inner development, and can we break with self-deception. So let's talk a little about some of these details. For example, the fanatic doesn't like to practice. Okay, they enjoy listening to the teachings, but rarely they take time to do the practices. And if they do try, they often give up at the first failure. So, for example, we talk about astral projection. They try to astral project once, two, and if they don't achieve that, that is not truth. They give up. Well, that is the fanatic self. And as a result, they don't develop real personal knowledge, right? They are content simply by repeating what they've heard from others. And for that reason, they usually rely on some leader or figure to believe in, right? They create dependency because they are followers of people, right? They are always looking for someone who seems wise or advanced, someone they can follow to feel, secure, right? They constantly seek an external master to guide them, but they don't actually turn inward to connect with the real master, right? Which is their inner being. Instead, they imitate others. They rely on the experiences of others, and they often go around affirming things that they haven't actually verified, just repeating what someone else said. They talk about spiritual experiences that they don't truly understand because those experiences actually don't belong to them. Yeah, and fanatic also. The fanatic defect is also driven by envy, because that defect feel uncomfortable around those who show real inner work, because envy leads them to compare themselves and they can stand feeling alone, right? So when someone genuinely tries to practice, to do, to come with something new, to, for example, spread the knowledge, the fanatic often steps in to discourage them, trying to take away their motivation and strength. Ironically, the fanatic may even start labeling others as fanatics, pointed out as the defect of fanaticism in everyone, pointed out defects in everything the other people are doing, but they never looked at themselves and never realize that they are never doing the work that they criticize other for attempting, right? And the fanatic defect is not only envy, but also lazy, right? Because they believe that the inner path is easy, simple as snapping your fingers. They are just satisfied just talking about the teachings, but out of laziness, they don't actually practice or verify anything. So they talk about psychological death, but they don't die to their defects. They speak about spiritual birth, but they don't engage in suprasexual practice. They could sacrifice more for humanity, but they don't. They settle for doing the bare minimum. And although they may tell others to practice, they themselves avoid practicing out of pure laziness. So then we can find our fanaticism, and they are highly intellectual, right? That is an important detail, and also something that exists in all of us is what we can call the false feeling of the self. And this is like a deep rooted illusion that makes us believe that we are doing just fine. And because of that, this point prevents that we see real progresses in this work, because this defect blinds us to the truth. And the truth is that all our psychological defects are still alive and active, that that we haven't eliminated them. That practice, and only practice, not belief, it is what makes a master. Okay? And that we haven't yet created existential bodies of the being, and that awakening the kundalini requires us to stop being traders disguised as gentle sheep, right? And that the inner work is still ahead of us. And perhaps the worst mistake of all is to believe and to feel that we are already good people, because that fact, that belief, prevents us from looking for true self discovery and for a real change. And well, another defect of fanaticism is tyranny. There we can find our fanatic self when we feel the need to defend our faith of our version of the truth, and we often believe that we are justified on imposing those beliefs in others. Convinced that we are doing it for their own good, we push others, try to put pressure on others to believe in what we believe, right? To follow the path we are following. When fanatics find themselves in a position of power, right, they often use fear or guilt to pressure others into accepting their beliefs, right? And we can recognize this defect in ourselves when we try to force our friends, our partner, our children to accept what we believe, thinking that we are saving them, right? And well, the fanatic always believes that they are better than everyone else, that they are safe, right? And sees those who don't accept the teachings, the religion, or the knowledge that they are following as condemned or lost. There we can find our fanatic defect. And well, another important detail of fanaticism is its connection with a false mysticism. The fanatic defect tends to turn the knowledge into a kind of religion, adding religious elements and external forms, because this defect is attached to rituals, right? And it becomes focused on outer appearances, the clothing, the postures, the ceremonies. The fanatic thinks that is the important thing. The external things are what really matters for the fanatic, not the inner work. Eventually, anything that doesn't fit with their mystical framework is seen as wrong, is seen as impure, and they start labeling things as negative simply because it doesn't align with their personal beliefs. And well, that is an important point also. And well, in conclusion, what fanaticism does is to bury us, right? It turns us into mediocre forces, into beings who ultimately are useless for real inner work. That's why it is important to study and eliminate the fanatic defect within us. Only then we can move forward on the path of knowing ourselves and through inner transformation. And well, this is fanaticism. Remember that if you have any question on this topic, or if you have any comment, right? You can leave them in the comment section, and there we will be sharing and solving your questions. Okay, and well, let's now talk about mythomania. Mythomania is another psychological defect that also leads us into self-deception. Mythomania is surprisingly common, especially among those involved in various metaphysical or spiritual schools, right? Ordinary people, after a few hallucinations or some vivid dreams, suddenly begin to fall into this pattern, becoming mythomaniacs almost overnight. It often begins with a lie, and after repeating to themselves and to others that lie enough times, the person can no longer tell if it really happened or not. The mythomaniac becomes accustomed to lying, and eventually they can no longer see anything wrong with it. They lie to convince others, and in the end, they deceive themselves. And that is why it's so important to become aware of even the smallest signs of these defects within us and begin to work on it on reflective meditation. Often, mythomania stems from feelings of inferiority when we need to feel important or accepted, right? A person when feeling those needs, right, of being accepted, begin to exaggerate things, adding details to their stories that never really happened. They want to impress, they want to be admired, right? And for that reason, they do so. So they begin to invent stories about, for example, astral experiences, about supernatural powers, claiming things like I've opened my third eye, or I've made contact with angels, or I've spoken with extraterrestrials, and things like that. But all of this is just part of a full story they are built in, right? Driven by the desire to appear special. Because what is a megalomaniac really looking for? They want to impress others, to amaze those who are naive or inexperienced, who hear their fantastic stories and believe them, right? And once those people are impressed, the people often become their followers. And that is the goal of the mythomaniac, to gain admiration, influence, attention, right? Through lies dressed as spiritual experiences. And well, the mythomaniac often lives in fantasies filled with impossible dreams and delusions of grandeur. In their mind, they imagine themselves to be special, important, extraordinary, and they end up believing it, right? So they present themselves to others as the reincarnation of some legendary master, as a guru, as a mythical hero, and the danger of this defect is that it not only distorts our inner path, but that also causes harm to the spiritual journey of many others. That is why mythomania is very dangerous, right? And it is essential that we observe and that we identify the details of mythomaniac within ourselves so we can begin to eliminate them. Some of the details of these defects include that delusion, of grandeur, which appears when we feel the need to appear superior or to appear special, right? We must discover those very subtle details sometimes. The urge to impress others, to make them believe that we are extraordinary people. Also, the tendency to lie. Every time that we add or that we remove things, parts of our story, just to make them sound more impressive, we must observe that. Also, we must observe the need to have followers. A person who is truly awakening consciousness encourages others to be independent, to follow themselves. That is their own inner being, right? And not to follow someone external. But the mythomaniac creates dependence in people. They manipulate others, making them believe that they need him, right? Also, they make absurd predictions. They generate fear, causing people to feel more insecure and thus more dependent to them, right? They speak ill of others, they criticize others, they spread discredit of others, they label others as black magicians, like pointing people as black magicians, for them to appear holy, superior, safe, and to create dependency on others. It is important to observe which of these traits we might carry in our own psychology and to reflect further to discover even more, right? Because those are only several details on the defects of mythomania. Because as we can see, this defect will block any true progress into the awakening of consciousness. And one interesting question to reflect on is, how are mythomaniacs formed? Well, often it begins with personification. This defect becomes a mental illness, and the person starts believing they are some exalted or divine being. Sometimes it starts with misinterpreted dreams. For instance, they may have watched a movie or read about a legendary hero or an important figure in history. And later, because their consciousness is asleep, they dream about that character, right? And what happens that because of this defect, they begin to fantasize until they are convinced that they are the reincarnation, right, of that person. And that is how sometimes these mythomaniacs are formed. There are also external factors that can contribute to the development of mythomania, such as the use of drugs, right? Having those or hallucinogenic substances, right? That under the influence of those substances, sometimes people have these out body experiences, infradimensional out of body experiences, and then their own psychological defects of mythomania show them things and they believe on those things and then pretend to be those things, right? Or, for example, going through extreme experiences like, for example, surviving a near death situation and then believing they were chosen by God, and from there on, it starts. And in other cases, fanaticism plays a role because when a person become a devoted follower of some mythomaniac, he could eventually, I mean, the mythomaniac could eventually convince that person, that fanatic, that they too are an enlightened or superior being. And from there, a mythomaniac will develop. But all of this only happens because the person, or if the person lack seriousness on his own inner work. If they are not really truly working on themselves, if they are not striving to awaken their consciousness, to practice psychological death from moment to moment, reflecting on their actions, on their intentions, on their reactions, on their feelings, and if they are not seeking the guidance of their own inner being, this is going to be like very common, right, to fall into these patterns. But in the end, you're gonna see that all mythomaniacs are like a wall without a foundation. And they shine for a moment, right? Only to fade away, leaving behind confusion and deep disorientation their followers, right? And eventually the truth always comes out. Sooner or later, these mythomaniacs are exposed, right? It's revealed that they were frauds, sometimes even abuser or rapist, right? And the saddest part of it all is that the people who follow them end up, you know, losing their spiritual longing entirely, and that is like the worst part of this mythomaniac process. So the purpose of this lecture, of the reflection that we are trying to do on this lecture, is to help us recognize the urgent need to work on these defects of fanaticism and mythomania within ourselves, to become aware that we all have these traits within our psychology, and we must understand that these defects have imprisoned a significant amount of our consciousness and that they have the power to block our awakening process. That is why it is essential to confront them through psychological death. Each of these subhuman elements must be eliminated from within if we want to set our essence free, because only by liberating the essence can real awakening happen, and only then, thus, through illumination, through real illumination begins to emerge from the death of all our psychological defects. And well, let's keep in mind that the worst form of self-deception is when we begin to believe and to feel that we are good, that we are elevated, that we are holy, having ahead a whole work on ourselves to be done. Because the moment we believe this, we stop seeing the need to change, right? We lose like the revolutionary impulse and we become stuck indefinitely in our inner development. And well, people, this concludes today's conference. I hope it has inspired some useful reflection. Feel free to leave your questions in the comment box. If you are not yet part of our WhatsApp or Telegram groups, here in the description of this video, you can find the link to join us. Remember that all these lectures and all the material that we share in our groups is totally for free. Sorry. And I want to invite you to our next conference where we'll be talking about the life and the level of the being. We are going to see how can we transform our life circumstances, right, by transforming and elevating our level of the being. That is a very powerful topic, so don't miss it. And well, thank you very much for being here. Remember, any question can be left there in the comment box. We'll be gladly solving all of your questions. Thank you very much, and well, see you the next time. Bye bye.